you stay alive for? That endless scurrying from bad to good to bad again must have been exhausting. And each return to bad brought with it a little flurry of deaths. Tell me, if you admired humans so much, why did you keep inflicting your failures upon them?
The year is 1845. Britain stood at the height of its empire, an era of relentless colonization fueled by greed and a need to claim dominion over every corner of the globe. The Arctic, with its endless expanse of ice and whispers of a northwest passage linking Europe and Asia, was the ultimate prize of their empire. But it was also a graveyard for ships and men who dared to challenge it. In May of 1845, Sir John Franklin set sail at the helm of this grand venture, commanding two of the most advanced ships of their time, the HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. Franklin was a man of experience and known as the man who ate his boots after surviving starvation on a previous Arctic mission. At 59, some questioned his fitness for such an endeavor, but his stature and determination silenced critics. His orders were simple: find the Northwest Passage and return as a hero. The ships themselves were a marvel of engineering, essentially spaceships of their time. Each had reinforced hulls lined with iron to withstand crushing ice, and state-of-the-art steam engines could propel them when the wind failed. Inside, they were stocked with 3 years of provisions, including over 8,000 tins of preserved food, a recent innovation that promised to sustain the men where hunting would fail. The officers' quarters were luxurious by naval standards, with libraries, musical instruments, and even a barrel organ to keep morale high. By all accounts, they were ready for anything, or so they thought. The journey began with promise. The expedition departed England to great fanfare and was last seen by whalers in Baffin Bay in July 1845. As the ships slipped into the Arctic waters, Franklin's men waved confidently from their decks, and their fate still unknowable. Months passed, then years. Back in Britain, concern grew. Delays on expeditions like this were common, but by 1848, the Admiralty could no longer ignore the silence. Something had gone horrifically wrong. The first search missions found little but hints of disaster. In 1850, explorers discovered a desolate camp by Beechey Island, marked by 3 graves of young crew members: John Torrington, William Brain, and John Hartnell. Their bodies, when later exhumed, revealed signs of lead poisoning, possibly from the expedition's improperly sealed food tins. The cold had preserved them eerily well, their faces still bearing traces of the terror they must have felt. But where were the ships? And more notably, where were the other 126 men? In 1859, a breakthrough came. Searchers found a cairn on King William Island containing a single message. Written in 2 parts, it initially recorded that all was well. Franklin was in command and the ships were wintering in the ice. But scribbled in the margins was a second harrowing update. The Erebus and Terror became trapped in ice for over a year and a half. Franklin had died on June 11, 1847, and by April 1848, the remaining 105 men, now led by Captain Francis Crozier and Commander James Fitzjames, had abandoned the ships. Their plan? To walk south toward the Canadian mainland, dragging sleds laden with supplies in the hope of a rescue. Over the following decades, more clues emerged, pieced together from Inuit testimony and scattered remains. Inuit hunters told of strange men staggering through the Arctic, starving, frostbitten, and desperate. Searchers found human bones on King William Island, some scarred with knife marks, a grim evidence that the men, driven mad by hunger, had turned to cannibalism. Their deaths were not a noble sacrifice for the sake of discovery. It was a slow, agonizing demise in a frozen wasteland. Now, for over 150 years, people speculated about the final fate of the Erebus and Terror as the ships became trapped and buried in ice. In 2014, though, archaeologists made a stunning discovery. Researchers discovered the wreck of the Erebus in shallow waters near King William Island, where its hull remained remarkably intact. 2 years later, explorers located the Terror miles away, upright on the ocean floor and preserved so well that it seemed frozen in time. Inside, researchers found untouched cabins, plates still on tables, and the detritus of lives abruptly ended. The discovery reopened old questions. What exactly doomed the expedition? It's likely that lead poisoning played a role, affecting the men's decision-making and physical health. Starvation, scurvy, and hypothermia compounded their suffering, and then there was their refusal or inability to adapt. The Inuit had lived in the Arctic for generations using ingenious methods to survive, but Franklin's men, bound by the European ways, seemed blind to that knowledge. They carried silver cutlery and fine china on their sleds, but they couldn't let go of the weight of their civilization, even as it dragged them down. Now, this might seem extreme, but I think not many games genuinely capture that visceral feeling of being doomed and struggling against a hostile world as some do. While many focus on simulating survival in post-apocalyptic settings, war zones, or even like on a distant planet, few dare to explore the quiet horror of succumbing to the elements. The main antagonist in these narratives often isn't a creature or enemy, but the unforgiving weather itself. Those rare games that meticulously craft a grueling and unapologetically challenging experience are remarkable, and I think that one standout title that embodies the unique approach to this genre is The Long Dark, developed by Hinterland Games and released in 2017. I was an original backer of The Long Dark when it was just a Kickstarter campaign in 2014. It was one of the first and only games I ever backed, and to this day, I don't regret it. The game became a massive project with expansions and an episodic story on top of the sandbox mode. I was inspired to revisit the game after binge-watching outdoor survival and bushcraft videos on YouTube. It's a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. I hadn't touched the game for a couple of years, and I was pleasantly surprised to find the development is very active still, and the community is also very active. Hinterland is still patching the game quite frequently, so the game still has some life in it. Hinterland is also hiring for their next project, which is a good sign that the developers are still going pretty strong. For the uninitiated, The Long Dark is a hardcore survival simulator with almost pathological attention to detail. It simulates everything from how many calories you burn to how wind affects your walking speed. The details are staggering when considering how much thought must have gone into the most straightforward mechanics. The game is set in the Canadian wilderness after a geomagnetic storm turns off all electronics and crashes your plane. The setting is based loosely on Vancouver Island and features mountain towns, frozen swamps, and jagged coastlines. It's desolate and it's beautiful, and maybe I'm a little bit biased because I do live here. Only a few survival games have this level of polish and take place in a setting like this. You can comb through thousands of survival games on Steam, and I challenge you to find one that looks this good and plays this well. I'm looking at you, Ark. I'm not saying that The Long Dark has it all figured out, but I argue that the art design and the vibes combine to make it something special in the survival space. Something that other games still have yet to replicate. I've mostly played sandbox mode, so I'll stick to speaking in depth about that. From what I can tell, the Wintermute story mode teaches you the mechanics and tells a well-crafted story, and people seem to like it. Not many survival games tell a well-thought-out story besides maybe Subnautica or The Forest or Sons of the Forest. However, I'm not here to critique the quality of the story for The Long Dark or any other survival games for that matter. Sandbox mode sees you dropped off into The Long Dark's many maps with nothing but the clothes on your back and a few matches. Your goal? Live till the morning, and that's not an exaggeration. Even on the lowest difficulty, you'll die the first day if you don't have adequate food, shelter, and warmth. It instills a fear in you, making me think, at the very least, of that first night in Minecraft when I was too stupid as a kid and didn't know how to craft a bed. This time, though, the monster is the cold, and death stalks you every minute. I'm being a bit dramatic, but it does feel like you're barely holding on to life, though. You'll run out of food quickly depending on what map you start on, and that means you're dying a slow and painful death. Besides the various meters you need to manage, there are compounding injuries to deal with, and hypothermia is just one of them. This game even has a scurvy mechanic. Seriously, what other games have that? I don't know. You can die from an infection, a sprained ankle, or falling through ice, a bear attack. The list is immense. And even spraining your ankle means you're out in the cold for longer and you can't travel as far to scavenge or hunt, which means you're probably going to die. It's almost too brutal at times. Now, I'm not the best player, but I've played a lot of survival games, and I like when they punish me for forgetting my food on the stove or getting lost in the snowstorm or letting my fire go out at night. It's pretty brutal. There's another side to the way The Long Dark paces its gameplay. There are a lot of opportunities for quiet moments between fighting for your life. It's that balance that creates the unique tension of The Long Dark. Beautiful vistas or meditative walks punctuate those moments of brutality and failure as you explore your surroundings, gathering firewood and supplies. Your survival is rewarded with the beauty of the frozen wilderness, making the struggle worth it in some weird way. Now, I'll compare it to The Forest, which is a fantastic survival game in its own right, but it tackles fear differently. The forest leans more into horror with its cavalcade of mutants and winding, blood-filled caves straight out of the film The Descent. The fear is overt and in your face, trying to scare you with every rustle in the bushes or scream at night. There's a palpable tension to the forest that you will feel from the moment you start to explore its forested island. Your first nights start off uneventful and things get stranger. Rather than a steady crescendo to violence, the long dark creates a slow, creeping fear of death. It's always lurking in the back of your mind. It surfaces more vividly when you're running away from wolves or you fall through ice, but the absolute terror lies in what remains after your mistakes. That gnawing dread transforms the long dark into a more oppressive experience than the forest or its sequel, in my opinion. The long dark lets you breathe between those acute moments of fear, and that's when the terrifying reality of your situation can really set in. If the forest is The Descent, the long dark is 127 hours. In some ways, that difficulty is detrimental to new players or those unfamiliar with survival games. As I said, the story mode teaches you the basics of mechanics, but nothing can quite prepare you for being dropped off in the middle of a frozen muskeg with no objective other than staying alive. The lack of thorough tutorials before dropping you into the sandbox is my only criticism of the game as someone who played back in version 1.0. A lot has changed since then, and a lot is changing in the game now. But that feeling of being stalked by death and clinging to life by a dying fire as wolves howl in the distance will always be there, and it will always be the long dark. Now, there aren't many games out there that I would call completely 100% Canadian. There are lots of games made in Canada, to be sure, The Forest and Sons of the Forest being examples of this, but there aren't many games that I would say embody the overarching themes of Canadian art and literature. Americans have manifest destiny and exceptionalism as some of their guiding literary themes. But what do Canadians have? Other than colonialism, one author in particular believes the central theme of all Canadian literature is survival and the struggle to survive against nature. Every choice in the long dark feels consequential because survival depends on an intricate balance of preparation, adaptation, and resourcefulness. The game doesn't hold your hand, forcing you to confront the hostile wilderness as it is, raw, indifferent, and lethal. I couldn't help but be reminded of a little-known book by Canadian author Margaret Atwood, most known for her novel The Handmaid's Tale, but she also has many books that critique Canadian literature. In her work Survival, a thematic guide to Canadian literature, Atwood asserts that survival, in its literal and metaphorical sense, is the central motif of Canadian literature, shaped by the vast and often inhospitable landscape of our country. It's a bit of a stretch as the story in the sandbox mode of The Long Dark is light, but the notes you find scattered throughout the game, most if not all written by Kickstarter backers, paints a picture of surviving in this world, not unlike what Atwood describes in Survival. Atwood critiques the European settler mentality in Canadian literature, which often pits people against the wild, essentially. And that trope kind of runs through The Long Dark, I think. The game captures the tension between human fragility and nature's overwhelming power. Much like the Franklin expedition, the player begins with the tools of civilization, matches, clothing, basic survival skills, but these quickly prove inadequate against relentless cold and hunger, which I have succumbed to many times in this game. The game forces players to adapt to their land rather than imposing their will upon it. It's worth mentioning that The Long Dark doesn't have a building system like other survival games. There's almost no way to shape the landscape you find yourself in. No way to build a wall or bulwark against the cold, or even to optimize how you store things. These are all things that other survival games have in spades. Atwood notes that Canadian literature often rejects the triumphalism of conquering nature found in American narratives. Instead, it portrays survival as a humbling act of coexisting with an unforgiving environment. Again, the balance The Long Dark strikes between the beauty and terror of nature is quite different from a game like The Forest, where the solution to your problem is a bigger spear or gun. Atwood also highlights how Canadian literature often views the wilderness not as an open frontier, but a claustrophobic trap, a prison in which survival becomes a moral and existential test. Great Bear Island in The Long Dark is a sprawling, unforgiving expanse, so vast it could take an entire in-game day just to traverse a single region. Its frozen lakes, jagged cliffs, and starlit skies offer fleeting moments of beauty, but those are quickly overshadowed by the harsh realities of isolation and vulnerability. The island doesn't care whether you live or die. It simply exists, and you can't escape that fact. Every step through that frozen hellscape reinforces the triviality of your attempts to survive in the face of nature's immensity. Both The Long Dark and Atwood's analysis highlight the same enduring truth, I think. Survival isn't just a test of physical endurance, it's a deeply psychological struggle, and you'll feel that when you play The Long Dark. The game forces players to contend with their limits and exist in a world where nature isn't malicious but indifferent. That indifference challenges you to adapt, persevere, and find some shred of meaning in the chaos of the wild. At its heart, that's what The Long Dark is all about. Enduring, surviving, and finding the will to keep going when the odds are stacked against you. I hope this shows you why The Long Dark is such a unique game in my opinion and why I have a soft spot for it. If it sounds interesting to you, you should definitely go check it out and support Hinterland. They are a really cool company. They don't develop games with crunch or anything like that. They really care about their people, it seems. So it's always good to support companies that do that. If you like what you watched, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps the channel and it lets me know that I'm doing well. So thanks again, and see you in the next one.